Okay, welcome. Today we are continuing the discussion of Hume, and to do so, we're going to look at Chapter 8 of Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, where Hume works out his theory of freedom of action. His title for the chapter is Of Liberty and Necessity. And Hume's basic idea is that we can attribute both liberty and necessity to human behavior. So here's the plan. The first thing I want to do is consider an example of skepticism about free will. That is the view that's sometimes known as hard determinism. And this was a view defended rather vociferously, that is, with a lot of force and vigor, by another thinker of Hume's time, Baron de Holbach. Paul Henry Theory was his given name, but his nobility name was Baron de Holbach, and that's how he's often known. After we look at Holbach's view, we're going to contrast Hume's view with it. And by the end of this discussion, you should have a grip on how to answer these questions in Hume's style, on the questions of how does necessity apply to human action? In what sense do we say that human actions have liberty? And we give a contrast between indifference and spontaneity. And finally, we look at the question of whether Hume's compatibilist approach fits with morality. So here's, once we've got a theory of the laws of nature, we tend to wonder, well, is there such thing as free will in human beings? And here's what Holbach says. He says, choice is necessary because he would not determine for an object or for an action if he did not believe that he should find in it some direct advantage. That man should have free agency, it were needful that he should be able to will or choose without motive. Notice what Holbach is saying here. He says that when people act, they act for reasons, right? That is, you don't just act for no reason, you do it because you see some advantage in the action that you choose. But then he's going to say, if we really had free will, you would be choosing without anything causing you to believe what you believe. But action always being the effect of your will once determined, you cannot but be determined by a motive which is not in your own power. It follows that this person is never the master of the determination of his own particular will, and that consequently he never acts as a free agent. So what's Holbach telling us here? Well, he seems to be suggesting that, your will is determined, right? There are explanations for the kinds of things that people do. And if that's the case, you would not have free will. And because that would disqualify your will from being free, and it is the case that your will is determined, that is, human beings do not act as free agents. To put this in the context, this is like a little chart. You've seen this in other videos of mine on, say, Descartes and Leibniz and Spinoza. This is sort of like our menu of and map of views about free will. Some people are determinists, right? So they believe that every event that ever happens is a necessary consequence of the present state or previous states of the universe and the laws of nature. So we might say that the way that things are right now in November 2023 is like the direct consequence and an inevitable consequence of the way things were in October. Right. Now, a further question beyond determinism is compatibilism versus incompatibilism. And the question of compatibilism versus incompatibilism is the question of whether a deterministic universe rules out the possibility of free will. Compatibilists think that free will is still possible even if the universe is deterministic. But the incompatibilist thinks otherwise. They think that if the universe is deterministic, then there could be no possible free will. So among incompatibilists, some are incompatibilist free will deniers, right? And this is what Holbach is doing, right? So Baron de Holbach basically says, look, the universe is deterministic, and we should realize, according to de Holbach, that if the universe is deterministic, there is no free will, and therefore there is none, right? So this line of thought that de Holbach has could be thought of as incompatibilist free will denial, or skepticism about free will, as it's sometimes called, or sometimes it's also called hard determinism. Right. Now, if you want to disagree with the hard determinist and say that we actually do have free will, some people are going to go for the libertarian route, saying like, look, when it comes to human actions, they are not determined. And compatibilists are actually going to say, look, there is free will, but it's not because the universe is indeterministic. In fact, the concept of free will completely fits with the concept of a deterministic universe. Now, many people tend to guess that Hume will be a libertarian on the basis of a simple understanding of Hume that says, look, Hume doesn't make any assertion about the regularity of the universe. Like, things could be very different tomorrow, the sun might not rise, and you might do something completely out of character. That's maybe an appealing line of thought for some people, but it actually is not Hume's view, right? That's actually a shallow reading of Hume. And once we look at chapter 7 of the Enquiry and realize that Hume does want to talk about deterministic senses of necessity and laws of nature, in the sense that he's going to say, look, we can talk about laws of nature insofar as we can look at regularities in nature, or things that we can't help but infer from certain courses of events to their consequences. And Hume, unlike de Holbach, is going to say that, like, look, we can talk about freedom of action, and not only do we believe in necessity, laws of nature, but you also believe in freedom in human actions. He's going to say, look, you believe in cause and effect. And not only do you believe in cause and effect when it comes to like billiard balls knocking around on the table, but you also believe in cause and effect when it comes to human nature. Right? He's also going to say, you believe in liberty. He's going to say, you have a working concept of free versus unfree actions. And in that way, you believe in that too. So Hume says, it's very improbable that you accept the incompatibilist definition of freedom that makes necessity and liberty incompatible. So let's see how he builds this. First, let's think about necessity. Hume tells us that our idea of necessity and causation arises entirely from the uniformity observable in the operations of nature, where similar objects are constantly conjoined together, and where the mind is determined by custom to infer the one from the appearance of the other. So this is the chapter 7 definition of necessity and causation, right? We say that, for instance, lit matches dropped into puddles of gasoline causes fire. Well, what we're saying there is that these things always go together, right? The trick for Hume and his theory of causation and necessity is that he doesn't think that you need to find a deep further fact. There isn't some magical power of gasoline that makes it light. He's going to say, in order to believe in cause and effect, you just have to observe a regularity of one event to the next. Now, here's the next point. So we can believe in necessity as it applies to interactions between bodies. You do this kind of thing, you get that type of result. And that happens when it comes to gravitation or observing billiard balls and so on and so forth. He's going to say this line of thought also applies to human behavior. So Hume is going to say just like every time you take an object and you let it drop, and it falls, we're going to say, look, that's the kind of thing that we observe a constant conjunction. He's going to say we also observe constant conjunctions between certain kinds of motives and certain kinds of actions in the universe. So, for instance, when people get hungry, they eat. This is very predictable. Now, we might think of cases where people don't eat because they don't have access to food or because they're trying to achieve some other goal that eating is seen to be incompatible with. But Hume is going to say, by and large, when you have people who truly desire to eat and there's food in front of them, they're going to eat, right? So Hume is going to say, look, people, human beings, are parts of nature, and we can find constant conjunctions in human behavior just as much as we find constant conjunctions, in the movements of billiard balls. He says, your belief in the regularity of human nature, that it's a predictable part of the natural world, he's going to say our idea of human nature regulates our evaluations of historical accounts. So if you were to read, a history of Rome or something, but this history, painted human beings to have such characters that they had no jealousy or no will of their own, that they were completely peaceful beings. You could imagine some kinds of histories which give us very strange pictures. Well, Hume is actually going to say, insofar as a historical account departs from our understanding of how human beings actually work, that's going to be a reason to actually discount the credibility of that historical work. So what is Hume pointing out here? He's pointing out that in day-to-day life, you believe that human behavior has many predictable patterns in it, many constant conjunctions, and constant conjunction is all we're really thinking about when we think about necessity and causation. Now, some people might say, yeah, but, human behavior is not predictable. We don't know, for instance, how the American public is going to vote a year from now in 2024. And we also get different effects from similar causes. But Hume is going to say variety and unpredictability are no argument against necessity. Because he is going to note that variations in effects can be accounted for in variation of causes. Right? So we might say, why is it that when I roll a die, sometimes it turns up a 1 and sometimes it turns up a 6? Well, he's going to point out that, you were holding the die a little different the first time, and you were throwing it in a different way from a different angle with different sides up, right? And we could say a similar thing about human behavior, right? Some people respond to certain stimuli in one way, other people respond to those same stimuli in different ways. But we would say, look, there is going to be a variation in causes. Right? Different people are going to respond to different stimuli because they have different characters. And that line of thought is completely deterministic in its characters. That doesn't undercut the line of thought, which is that human nature is part of nature writ large, and human behavior works according to the laws of necessity. Here's another example. Unpredictability. Well, we already saw that with the throwing the die example, but we could also talk about weather, right? We might think that weather behaves according to deterministic patterns, but it's also very hard to predict. So the fact that weather is hard to predict does in no way undercut the claim about determinism. And Hume is also going to note there are causes for human behavior when it's unusual. In fact, when somebody acts strangely, we try to find a reason. We don't just say that people act for no reason. Here's a really fun paragraph in Hume. He says, "The most irregular and unexpected resolutions of men may frequently be accounted for by those who know every particular circumstance of their character and situation. Because a person of an obliging disposition, somebody who's usually very friendly, gives a peevish answer." Right, so this is somebody who gets like snappy with you. And you might say that makes no sense, especially when they're regularly a nice person. But he says, but he has a toothache or is not dined. What I find very funny here is that in contemporary 21st century parlance, people will often talk about being hangry, that is, being a little short of temper because you have not eaten. Well, Hume basically noticed this phenomenon back in the 1700s, that a person could explicably be giving a peevish answer because they haven't eaten recently. Here's another example he gives. He says, "A prisoner who has neither money nor interest discovers the impossibility of his escape as well when he considers the obstinacy of the jailer as the walls and bars with which he is surrounded." So, you have a prisoner in a jail cell and realizes that just in the way that, steel bars and walls are predictable and hard to get around, it's also the obstinacy, that is, the stubbornness of the person guarding the jail. And in fact, he says, when this person is attempting to make themselves free from being jailed, they choose to work upon the stone and iron of the walls and bars rather than on the inflexible nature of the other, that is, the jailer. So in this way, Hume says, look, you believe that stone and iron are predictable in the way that they behave? Well, we think about people in that way too. In fact, in one of the Star Wars movies, one of the characters, Rey, is able to perform a miracle, and they didn't have to do any special effects. The joke in this miracle was that Rey uses the Force by just telling the guard in the jail, you will unlock my shackles, and the jailer just says, okay, I will unlock your shackles, and lets her go. Now, in this way, we would say, look, getting people to behave in a completely unpredictable way like this is just as much a violation of the laws of nature as, say, making iron bars dissolve. Right? So, Hume's line of thought here is that our thinking about human behavior and motivation is not fundamentally different from our other reasoning about cause and effect. And if you notice constant conjunctions in nature, and those constant conjunctions in nature, lead you to believe that, leaves fall from the trees in a predictable and law-like way in November here in North Carolina, well, we can also say things about people, right? People get cranky when they haven't eaten for a while. So now we look at the concept of liberty for Hume. What does liberty mean? This is a big, long-standing philosophical question. What is it to be truly free? Here's what Hume says. We cannot surely mean that actions have so little connection with motives, inclinations, and circumstances that one does not follow with a certain degree of uniformity from the other. So, basically, Hume is going to say, actions cannot be said to be not caused by things, right? So when we say, in the circumstances that one does not follow with a certain degree of uniformity from the other, and that affords one and that one affords no inference by which we can conclude the existence of the other. He goes on. For these are plain and acknowledged matters of fact. So he's saying, like, look, we've already acknowledged that human behavior derives from your motives, inclinations, and circumstances. So he's basically saying that, as a matter of fact, everybody admits that human behavior is predictable and regular in its patterns. Right? By liberty, if it doesn't mean being caused by nothing or being uncaused, he says we can only mean a power of acting or not acting according to determinations of the will. That is, if we choose to remain at rest, we may. If we choose to move, we also may. Right? Whereas you would not be free to remain resting if, for instance, the cops came and picked you up off the sofa you were resting on. Right? Now, this hypothetical liberty is universally allowed to belong to everyone who is not a prisoner and in chains. So Hume is going to say, look, when we're talking about acting freely, it's doing as you choose, and it's being not restrained by outside forces from acting in the ways that you choose. So sometimes this is characterized. Hume is against the idea of liberty of indifference, that is, the liberty of having your actions uncaused. So he's not going to say, like, look, we don't need your actions to be uncaused to be free. What you need is to be given the ability to act according to your own choices and desires. That's what freedom is really all about for Hume. Now, this leads us to a really interesting objection. In fact, my first philosophy teacher, way back when, gave me this very objection when I was first learning about free will. And he said, one of the reasons why you should believe in free will is because you need free will to think about ethics and morality. Right, so some people are going to say, look, we need free will because if there's only one way that the universe can be, why bother doing ethics? Morality would not make any sense. Now, here's Hume's reply. He's actually going to say, in fact, quite the opposite. He's going to say, not only can we do ethics with an acknowledgement of necessity, that is, determinism in the world, but Hume would say, like, look, we couldn't do ethics without deterministic thinking. Here's a couple of points that Hume gives us. He says, look, blame and punishment wouldn't make any sense, either as emotional responses or attempts at reforming wrongdoers, if actions weren't caused by character traits which are responsive to blame. So, on Hume's theory, what are we doing when we do morality? Well, we're praising and blaming people, right? And what we're doing when we praise and blame people is we consider a person and their character. And insofar as we consider a person and their character, what we are doing is we are saying, like, look, there is an entity which is the explanation of somebody's behaviors, that is, their virtues or their vices. And if certain behaviors just came out of nowhere, then you wouldn't really have anything or anyone to blame. So in that way, we believe in a deterministic link between character and action. And he also points out that, look, people are responsive to blame. If you say, boo, hiss, you did a bad thing there, part of why we do that is because that often gets people to reconsider their behavior, maybe work on their character a little bit. And in this way, we're going to say, look, determinism actually gives ethics a point because it's a way of interacting with people and their character. Hume is further going to push this point. He says, like, look, imagine even if God knew someone was going to rob you, like it was determined, right? It's a complete inevitability in the course of nature. Hume says, like, look, even if this person does that necessarily, it would still make sense to get mad at the robber, right? We might think, like, look, we don't have to ask the question of whether the robber truly could have done otherwise or whether the laws of nature necessitated him to do it. We just have to ask the question, was the robber acting from malice or in consideration of your concerns and your property? If you can answer that question, yes. Hume says that's fully enough to answer the question of, whether morality makes sense. And in this way, we don't need an indeterministic universe to do morality. So here's how Hume puts it. He says, our distinction between virtue and vice, so now I'm quoting, is, quote, founded in the natural sentiments of the human mind. And these sentiments are not to be controlled or altered by any philosophical theory or speculation whatsoever. So it seems like what Hume is saying here is that when people rob you, let's say, you are going to be angry at them, maybe very angry at them. And moreover, your anger at the robber is not going to be lessened or reduced by having some philosophical thought about the idea of the laws of nature and that things had to turn out in the way that they turned out. Maybe a further philosophical reflection that maybe freedom means indifference from being caused by things. Hume is actually going to say, no, emotions are your emotions, and you're not going to be talked out of them. And moreover, he's going to say, like, look, in a certain way, trying to redo your emotions on the basis of philosophical theorizing is just kind of a mistake. Here's a thought. Like, what if somebody, let's say not gets robbed, but imagine if a person, finds that they have cancer, right? And you come up to that person and say, well, think about it this way. It's all part of God's plan, and there's no other way that things could have turned out. Do you think that's really going to lessen that person's feelings of upset and frustration about having cancer? And we might say, no, right? And in this way, we might think that, these concerns about determinism or indeterminism and libertarian views of free will sort of miss the point that our responses to the moral behavior of others isn't really concerned about this broader philosophical speculation about whether the universe really could have been otherwise. In fact, I would submit that this is an interesting philosophical insight, and it precedes a very famous 20th century paper by the philosopher P.F. Strawson. Right, so P.F. Strawson wrote a famous paper called Freedom and Resentment. Right, and in P.F. Strawson's paper, Freedom and Resentment, he makes a rather famous argument, which says, look, our reactions of praise and blame, our emotional responses to the characters of others, we do not ask questions about whether the universe could have gone a different way or not. The questions that we should be asking are questions about the nature of people's character, and philosophical theorizing isn't going to talk us into or talk us out of our emotional responses to the character of others. Now, Strawson is lauded and considered, an important genius of the debates of free will for making this point. This is considered a significant Strawsonian point. I would submit that that same insight is closely anticipated. It's not stated in the exact same way, but it is anticipated in the suggestion at the end of chapter 8, where Hume tells us that ultimately philosophical speculation cannot talk you in or out of praise or blame. In fact, this is just a natural response that we have to the character of others. But in the larger argument for Hume, he's going to point out, look, you believe in necessity, not only in behaviors in the world, but also in human behavior. So not just objects in motion, but people in action. And furthermore, we do have the concept of liberty, which does not require us to be thinking about whether or not the universe is deterministic. And that's going to be Hume's contribution to this debate about free will, and what I see as a new and novel approach to free will that we didn't quite see in the earlier arguments of Locke or Leibniz or Hobbes. So I'll leave that for you to reflect on. And until next time, keep philosophizing, and if you need anything from me, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Take care.